Hello and welcome. My name is David Callahan, and I am with the College of Sciences Middle East Initiative in partnership with the Curtis Studies Program. And I have Mr. John Gilbert here. John Gilbert is a senior science fellow with the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation and was a senior arms control analyst with a large professional and technical services company where he has supported a variety of national and international chemical, biological, and nuclear material control, non-proliferation, and counter-terrorism initiatives. He has specialized in on-site inspection, operations, and management. Thank you, John.
And thank you.
So, just to start, could you inform us regarding the different types of chemical weapons, if there are any?
There are several different types of chemical weapons. A lot of them are well known, but their differences are important. One of the ones that people are aware of is something called mustard, or mustard gas. Mustard actually is something that is not a gas, it's a liquid, but when it comes in contact with the human body, it forms enormous blisters, either on the skin or in the lungs. And that can cause death over a period of hours, and it's very agonizing. Another type of chemical agent is a family of nerve agents. Those typically affect people by causing paralysis. Two of these are well known and have been used as recently as the past year: sarin and VX. Sarin is volatile, it's a liquid at room temperature, and it evaporates very quickly. It's also heavier than air, so it could be used effectively against people who, for example, were hiding in basements to escape aerial bombs. This chemical was used by Aum Shinrikyo in 1995 for a terrorist attack on the Tokyo subway system, and it caused a number of casualties. It's also been used against civilians by Iraqi and Syrian military forces. The effect of sarin has a number of effects on the human body. It can paralyze respiration, it interferes with muscle movement, and there are some very characteristic symptoms that people exhibit when they're affected by a nerve agent. But sarin is the one that has been used most frequently against civilians. There's also an agent called VX, which is very thick. It's like motor oil, and it is more of a contact agent. It basically has to be applied to the skin or breathed in order to be effective. And there are some others. There is a nerve agent family called Novichok, which means newcomer or new guy, that was developed by the Soviets and the Russians, and it appears to be the agent that was used in Salisbury to assassinate a Soviet emigre and his daughter. Other chemicals can also be used as chemical weapons, and an example from within the past week is chlorine, which has been used in barrel bombs by the Syrian government against insurgent forces. Chlorine is also heavier than air, and it causes people to suffocate. It can also be used in combination with something like a nerve agent to increase the number of people who are affected by the attack.
So, do you think that chemical weapons belong in the category of weapons of mass destruction with things such as like nuclear, radiological?
They absolutely do. Their effects go way beyond the immediate location where they're used. For example, if chlorine is released inside a building, it could spread throughout the entire lower floors of whatever building it was released in. If sarin is released in the air, it can drift for up to several hundred feet and then settle down into low areas and cause damage way beyond the point where it was detonated or released. But perhaps another way to look at chemical weapons is not necessarily a weapon of mass destruction, but as a mass casualty weapon, because the chemicals themselves do not have a damaging effect on buildings or vehicles themselves, but the people who are in the vicinity.
During the Obama administration, there was a sort of red line set up in Syria saying that if Syria continued to use chemical weapons, that the U.S. would step in. However, afterwards, there was really no military stepping in. What could have been a more effective U.S. response in terms of that, or do just kind of the realities of the international realm take precedent?
The fact that President Obama announced a red line and was later unable to follow up with military action, I think has set back the cause of chemical arms control by quite a bit. But I think some perspective is useful on that. Immediately after the attack on the Damascus suburb of Ghouta, it was widely known what had happened and who was responsible for the attack. And the United States actually did formulate attack plans. However, the president chose, instead of acting on his own initiative or whatever authority he had, to seek authorization for use of force from Congress. And then an unfortunate thing happened. While trying to recruit other countries to support the U.S. in retaliatory attacks, the United Kingdom Parliament took up the issue and they voted to refuse to allow British forces to participate in a retaliatory strike. Shortly after that, the U.S. Congress decided they would not authorize the use of military force, and that essentially tied President Obama's hands. I don't know whether the U.S. congressional action was done out of principle or simply because Congress at the time was dominated by the opposite party and they may have wanted to obstruct anything President Obama wanted to do and perhaps embarrass him and make him look weak. One of the results of that, though, was a very positive development, or I'd rather say promising development. Syria was forced to agree to join the International Chemical Weapon Convention, which is a treaty that bans chemical weapon possession and use worldwide and has inspection requirements associated with it. Within 6 to 8 weeks after the attack, Syria signed on to that international treaty and started to meet the obligations of informing the world on what they had and starting the process of turning it over to be eliminated under international inspection. So that at the time looked like it was a positive development.
What should be the U.S.'s response to these sort of attacks?
It's difficult to say. I think most people would agree that using chemical weapons to harm civilians is probably something that everyone should object to. But how to deter states from continuing to do it has proved to be difficult, not the least because some of the states that have been implicated, particularly Syria, have a very strong sponsor in Russia and a strong ally in Iran. And the relative isolation of Syria and the fact that there are few U.S. military bases in the area makes it difficult to coordinate an attack that might be more effective than the one that was initiated a little over a year ago. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do operationally, and strategically it's important to understand what end result you want, whether as a country we would want to punish someone for what they've already done or whether we want to also deter them from doing it again. That's categorically two different things, and it affects the degree of military response or economic sanction response that people can agree on.
So, talking about response, how would you compare the U.S. response to Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq doing chemical attacks against the Kurds in the 1980s compared to the current attacks going on in Syria last year and most recently a few weeks ago?
Well, there are a lot of differences here. And in particular, the most well-known attack by Iraq was conducted against the Kurdish population in the town of Halabja a little over 30 years ago this month. That was an attack that appeared to be part of an Iraqi government campaign to eliminate or punish the Kurds. The end result of that attack was that between 3,000 and 5,000 people died almost immediately, and many thousands more were affected, and to this day still show genetic and health effects as a result. But after the attack, there were long delays in speaking out and determining who actually conducted it. Initially, the U.S. government, through several agencies, offered their opinion that Iran had actually conducted the attack, not Iraq. So that made identification of the perpetrator in any action really difficult. Over time, it emerged that, in fact, it was the Iraqi government that was behind it and that it was part of a coordinated campaign against the Kurds. One of the other things that was uncovered was that a lot of Western technology had been used by Iraq to develop and grow their chemical weapon program. That included technology including process equipment that was obtained from Western Europe, from German and Dutch firms, and a number of what are called precursor chemicals that are needed to synthesize something like the nerve agent sarin or mustard agent were actually provided by companies based in the U.S. that may have violated export regulations. But the entire story was not known at the time, and as bits and pieces of information became known over years, the simple passage of time and other world events had made it very difficult to retaliate for that particular chemical weapon attack. If you remember, in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. That precipitated a conflict that superseded any reaction that the other countries might have had just against this chemical attack that had occurred over 2 years previously.
So you mentioned sort of difficulty to find out who caused the chemical attack, usually in the beginning, and that's actually instance recently where Assad has claimed no responsibility and there are reports of false flag and stuff like that. Is that a potential advantage of using chemical weapons? And how should the international community kind of respond with something like that?
Yes, I think it's a deliberate attempt by the Syrian government and by the Russian government to deflect responsibility, to deny their involvement or to deny their support or acquiescence. And I think it's part of a deliberate strategic plan because attributing a chemical attack can be difficult. There are some attributes of individual chemicals that can be used to fingerprint them, but you cannot learn that from a distance. You actually have to have someone at the site of the attack who can collect samples and analyze them very carefully to determine what chemicals were likely used and to see if any of the characteristic fingerprints are present. Another thing, too, that has been very prevalent in this particular attack this month in Douma, Syria, is that internet trolls have dominated the search engines that are available internationally to look for news about this particular attack. I would say 90% of the internet posts that I've been able to access over the last few days have obviously been written by trolls. They duplicate each other's statements and they duplicate some of the ridiculous explanations that have been put out there, like the insurgents hired child actors, or that they deliberately killed their own relatives, or that the attack never really happened. So, there's a lot of deliberate fake news out there in this case, plus the fact that Russia has flatly denied that they supported any chemical weapon activity, and they actually vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have started the process of imposing sanctions or authorizing use of force against Syria.
Sort of switching gears, was Trump's military strike in response to Obama's kind of previous failure with the Red Line? Is this kind of a domestic power play, or is it actually humanitarian on some level?
Okay. The attack you're referring to happened shortly after April 4th a year ago, when the insurgent-held town of Khan Sheikhoun in Syria was attacked with a sarin-filled chemical weapon that was dropped from or fired from a Syrian Air Force aircraft. The evidence for that is absolutely ironclad. The aircraft was observed by Syrian insurgents taking off from a particular airfield. It was observed in flight and in the vicinity where the attack occurred, and it was observed landing again at that same airfield. In addition, there's radar data that tracked the entire flight of that aircraft, and the debris found at the site of the attack included fragments that had Cyrillic, meaning Russian alphabet, writing on them, meaning it's very possible that some of the components of whatever munition was used had actually been obtained from the Russians. Based on the totality of evidence for how the attack was conducted, where it originated, it's my strong feeling that the attack that was conducted a few days later was totally proportionate and intended to send a signal of retribution based on incontrovertible evidence. But I also think there were a couple of other motives. One of President Trump's apparent motivations has been to undo anything possible that his predecessor had done, or if President Obama had done something, President Trump wanted to do the exact opposite. So drawing a red line and not conducting an attack would be considered Obama's response. Conducting an unannounced attack in retaliation could very well have been done just simply because of an intent to embarrass, humiliate, or show a direct change of policy by President Trump.
Kind of with this, you could see that this attack, while it was abrupt and arguably kind of effective, there's still chemical attacks going on again recently. So is another strike going to happen just for a year later for there to be more chemical weapons, or is there going to be boots in the ground to kind of assert better control?
That's going to be difficult. At present, there's no reliable public information as to exactly where the weapons used this week and in a few past instances had been stored and where the helicopters or aircraft that dropped them had taken off from. So without that solid information, it's difficult to conduct a focused attack. And it's also important to determine what type of campaign you want to conduct. If, as a president, you want to conduct a single action to punish or deter, it might not be effective, as we saw a year ago. Because since that attack a year ago, there have been numerous instances of chlorine being used as a weapon, including this past week with catastrophic effect in Duma. So it's a tough choice. The United States and other Western governments have very few military personnel on the ground in Syria, and they're mostly in locations where they have been conducting a campaign against ISIS. There are not sufficient forces to occupy a large amount of territory, and it would be virtually impossible to do so without broadening the war and bringing the United States and Russia into direct confrontation, or the United States and allies into direct confrontation with Syrian government military forces. It could become an extremely broad war and very difficult to make it a focused campaign. That's why I'm glad I'm not president.
Some people are kind of skeptical about the difference between chemical and conventional weapons because if you look at statistics, more people are killed by conventional weapons than chemical weapons. What makes this kind of skepticism sort of warranted, or what makes it rise up?
Okay, I think a good rationale is to look at the effect of a weapon that extends way beyond the point where it's released. If a simple bomb, an explosive bomb, or an explosive rocket is launched from an aircraft, it's going to hit one target. And there will be damage and casualties in a defined area. It may do a lot of damage to buildings, but the damage from a particular bomb or particular rocket tends to be confined. For a chemical weapon, the actual effects can be very widespread and cause damage to people way beyond the area where it was actually used. It's indiscriminate. And in some cases, if persistent agents like mustard or VX are used, the effects are long-lasting and could seriously impede any rescue and recovery efforts to aid victims in an area where a chemical attack occurred. With a conventional attack, once the bomb is dropped, the debris stops falling, and the fires are put out, the damage is contained. With a chemical attack, it could go on for days, weeks, or in the case of people affected, it can affect them for the rest of their life.
You mentioned previously Aum Shinrikyo and their sarin gas attack in Tokyo subways. What makes chemical weapons so useful or kind of sought after by non-state actors or terrorist groups like ISIS?
I think one of the principal motivations is the fear that chemical weapons inspire because of the fact that they're widespread, indiscriminate, and victims usually do not know they've been exposed until they have profound symptoms. The people on the Tokyo subway were able to smell something, but they had no idea what it was. Ultimately, 10 people died from exposure to the sarin, and several thousand suffered lesser effects. But the fact that something occurred that you couldn't see, couldn't feel, could smell, and realize it was unusual, followed by an uncontrollable physical effect, I think that causes terror. And if the purpose of a terrorist group is to cause terror, a chemical weapon is a good thing to use. Militarily, it's not particularly effective, but it does have a psychological effect on victims and people who are witnesses, even if they're not victims.
How do you evaluate the long-term prospects for attempts to kind of control and eradicate chemical weapons?
It's going to take political courage on the part of a lot of countries. There is a control mechanism. The Chemical Weapons Treaty is actually implemented by an organization called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. It's headquartered in The Hague, and it's responsible for evaluating data on countries' chemical weapon and industrial chemical programs and conducting inspections to confirm or refute the accuracy of those data declarations. The organization has also conducted investigations at the sites of some of the chemical attacks in Syria, and they produced extremely forensically tight evaluations of what happened. But politically, it's very difficult to have countries understand what happened, who was responsible, and then actually take the step of voting for a measure to punish somebody. In the United Nations OPCW network, there have been numerous reports that stated absolutely what had happened where, but they were not allowed by their charter to draw a conclusion as to who was responsible. That was sort of a minimally acceptable charter that those organizations had and those missions had. So it's difficult to present evidence of what happened and not be able to say absolutely who did it, and therefore let's collectively decide on punishment. Another problem is that the OPCW itself does not have authority to act beyond the constraints of the treaty. For example, they could act against Syria by not allowing Syrian nationals to hold positions with the organization. They could lay them off as punishment, or do the same with any other country that had violated the prohibitions of the Chemical Treaty. But the organization itself does not have the authority to advocate military force. That would have to be a referral to the United Nations. And the United Nations Security Council has considered several resolutions for sanctions and that could have led to military force, but they were vetoed by Russia. So the fact of a veto in the Security Council will probably act as a constraint unless countries overwhelmingly decide to act. And the only way the Security Council can be overridden is to take an issue to the overall UN General Assembly, where there are no vetoes, but a massive vote would be needed to authorize force. I don't know that the political will exists to do that. I'm pessimistic. I think it should happen, but I'm pessimistic that it will in the short term.
John Gilbert, thank you for coming out.
And thank you.